Hello, fans of Hollywood's dark underside. You thought the stars of the Golden Age lived in luxury paid for by fat checks? Think again. Today, we're peeking into their dressing rooms, places that looked less like sanctuaries of glamour and more like warehouses of stolen goods and private pawn shops. I've put together a top 10 of legends who mistook the film set for a free supermarket and didn't hesitate to steal from everyone around them, even their own friends. We're about to pry open the chests of those who spent years hauling everything off set, from silver spoons to antique swords, calling it a personal bonus for their genius. Get comfortable. This parade of greed and kleptomania is one you won't forget. Subscribe, hit the bell, and let's start rummaging through other people's closets. Dorothy Lamour. When we think of Dorothy Lamour, the image that springs to mind is an exotic beauty wrapped in tropical colors, singing ballads against a backdrop of cardboard palm trees. But behind the facade of an innocent screen siren hid one of the sharpest minds in Hollywood when it came to anything considered unclaimed. Dorothy's career in the Road to films brought her millions, but apparently that wasn't enough. Paramount Studios became more than a workplace for her. It was a giant supermarket where every price tag read zero. Lamour had a rare talent. She could charm a producer with a smile, while her other hand was already closing around an antique figurine on his desk. This wasn't need, it was sport, a high-stakes game against the system with her good girl image as the wager. She started small, powder compacts, hairpins, gloves, but the appetite of the Queen of the Sarong quickly grew to the scale of the studio's storage rooms. Makeup artists and costume designers whispered that after Dorothy's visits, half the inventory would mysteriously vanish from a soundstage. But who would dare search the leading lady of box office gold? Lamour's greatest weakness was jewelry. In the era of classic Hollywood, studios often rented real diamonds or commissioned lavish costume pieces from the finest craftsmen so everything on screen would sparkle for real. For Dorothy, the line between rented and owned disappeared instantly. The moment the director shouted cut, rings, brooches, and necklaces began their journey into oblivion. Dorothy developed a system. She would complain that a clasp was stuck and ask permission to remove the piece in her dressing room so as not to delay the shoot. The moment she crossed the threshold of her private refuge, the item dissolved into thin air. When the costumers came to collect the inventory, Lamour, wearing the most innocent expression imaginable, would say she must have lost the trinket during a dance or accidentally dropped it somewhere in the set. The most astonishing part was that they believed her, or pretended to, because the loss of a necklace meant nothing compared to the profits she generated. All of Hollywood knew one rule: if you wanted to keep a family heirloom, don't leave it in plain sight when Dorothy walked by. Dorothy Lamour was a master of self-deception. In her memoirs and rare interviews, she would flash a sweet smile and call her actions collecting memories. To her, nothing was stolen, it was borrowed as a souvenir. She genuinely believed the studio was a soulless machine that took her youth and beauty, and that gave her every moral right to compensate herself with a couple of silver trophies or an antique mirror from a set. In her mind, she built a convenient philosophy. These objects wanted to be with her. They reminded her of triumphs and fame. Dorothy even hosted dinner parties where she proudly showed guests items any seasoned prop master would recognize instantly. She turned her home into a museum of stolen goods, where every exhibit had a criminal past but was presented as a gift of fate. The audacity was so extreme that no one even tried to take her to court. Lamour was simply too big for something as mundane as theft accusations. Working alongside Bob Hope and Bing Crosby was a goldmine, but even her partners weren't safe from Dorothy's sticky fingers. Hope liked to joke that she was the only person alive who could steal a rug from a room without waking the person sleeping on it. It was half a joke, Behind the scenes, actors learned not to leave personal belongings around her. There were rumors that Bing Crosby once searched her dressing room as a prank and found a full set of silverware from the studio cafeteria. Lamour didn't even blush. She calmly said the spoons were lying badly and she wanted to save them from the inevitable disappearance. Her colleagues understood they were dealing with something more than greed. This was deep, unconscious kleptomania that made her dangerous even to friends. Dorothy could hug you goodbye and you'd go home without your cufflinks, wondering where you'd lost them, while the queen of souvenirs was already carefully labeling a new trophy in her collection. By the time Dorothy Lamour left the stage, her collection had reached terrifying proportions. After her death, her heirs discovered a vast trove of items that had been considered lost for decades in the archives of Paramount and other studios. It was a real warehouse of 1940s Hollywood, from hand-embroidered gowns to heavy furniture from historical epics. Dorothy looted the system with such elegance and scale that she could be called a reverse Robin Hood. She stole from wealthy studios to make herself even wealthier. Her story isn't a nostalgic fairy tale, it's a hard lesson in how star status grants absolute impunity. Lamour proved you could be the nation's sweetheart while robbing it blind, hiding the spoils behind exotic flowers and sarongs. She remains an icon of style, but for those who worked behind the scenes, Dorothy was forever that girl with the bottomless handbag, the one who left dressing rooms stripped down to bare walls.
Hedy Lamarr was a Hollywood anomaly, a dazzling screen goddess who, between film shoots, invented a secret communication system that would later become the foundation of modern Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. But there was another Hedy as well. The one who wandered through the luxury department stores of Los Angeles with a feverish gleam in her eyes and empty shopping bags ready to be filled. In 1966, the world recoiled at the headlines. Style icon arrested for stealing cheap costume jewelry and laxatives from a drugstore. It sounded absurd. A woman whose face had inspired Disney's Snow White caught committing petty theft. Yet for Lamarr, this was no accident. Her brilliant analytical mind, capable of calculating radio frequencies, short-circuited when faced with an ordinary cash register. She did not see stores as places of commerce, but as proving grounds for her own invisibility. Kleptomania became her personal frequency-hopping system. Only instead of signals, she intercepted other people's belongings, hoping her status would shield her from disgrace. The incident at the Mayco department store marked the beginning of the end for her reputation. Wrapped in furs and hidden behind oversized sunglasses, Hedy attempted to walk out with goods totaling just over $20. The security guards, who at first could not believe their eyes, stopped her at the exit. Inside her handbag were items she could have bought by the hundreds without glancing at the price tags. In court, Lamarr performed like a grand tragic actress. She fluttered her lashes, feigned amnesia, and insisted that she had simply forgotten to pay because of profound emotional distress. Hollywood's elite was stunned. Stealing props from a studio, as many did, was one thing. Being caught red-handed in public like an ordinary shoplifter was another entirely. The press subjected Hedy to a merciless public flogging, savoring every detail of her arrest. The beauty that had shielded her for decades suddenly turned into a curse. Every headline screamed about how far the goddess had fallen. Hedy Lamarr's kleptomania had deep roots. By the 1960s, her career lay in ruins, and 5 failed marriages had left behind nothing but bitterness and lawsuits. Stealing became her way of reclaiming control over a world that had rejected her. She did not need the objects themselves. She needed the sense of victory, proof that she could still outwit someone. To her, a stolen necklace was not jewelry, but a trophy in a war against reality. Hedy liked to repeat that any girl can be glamorous. All she has to do is stand still and look stupid. But she herself was never stupid. Her thefts were acts of aggression against an industry that exploited her face while ignoring her mind. Every stolen lipstick or ring was a small act of revenge against a world that no longer paid her fees, yet still demanded she live up to the image of perfect beauty. Hedy learned nothing from the first scandal. In 1991, it happened again in Florida. The 76-year-old star was once more arrested for stealing laxatives and eye drops. This time, the court showed mercy, citing her age and her past contributions to science, but her reputation was beyond repair. Hedy became a recluse, hiding in her home behind tightly drawn curtains. She developed a panic-stricken fear of people, suspecting everyone of wanting to expose her or steal her inventions. The paradox of her life was devastating. A woman who had given humanity freedom of communication found herself imprisoned by her own psychological disorders. Her house was crammed with boxes of belongings, many of them of questionable origin. She continued collecting souvenirs from a life she could not let go of, turning her intellect into a tool for justifying small sins. Hedy Lamarr died alone, leaving behind a world connected by her technologies and archives filled with police reports. She proved that genius and madness often walk hand in hand, especially in Hollywood, where the line between reality and fiction dissolves with an alarming speed. Hedy remains in history as an inventor whose name every engineer now knows. But for those who remember the scandal sheets of the 60s, she will forever be that beauty from the department store. The hands that sketched blueprints of the future could not resist the glitter of a cheap present. She robbed Hollywood of its ideals, showing that even the greatest mind can surrender to the smallest temptation. Hedy departed without settling her accounts with fate, but she left us signals we still catch today, trying not to think about how many stolen rings those fingers once clenched.
Veronica Lake. Veronica Lake was the embodiment of noir. Her icy beauty and the famous peekaboo hairstyle that veiled half her face made men freeze in their tracks and sent women rushing to salons to copy her look. But Hollywood is a meat grinder, and by the early 50s, Veronica realized her time was over. The fame evaporated, contracts burned to ash, and the luxury limousines were replaced by cheap bars and rented corners. As her career collapsed, so did her mind. Once the most sought-after actress at Paramount, she began looking for comfort in a bottle and in other people's pockets. Veronica, who had grown accustomed to believing the world belonged to her by birthright, could not accept the role of a has-been. For her, stealing became more than a way to survive. It was a painful attempt to preserve status. If she couldn't buy something, she took it, convinced the world still owed her for the millions she had earned studios. That was the beginning of her descent, a fall whose finish line was not red carpets, but the dirty floor of a shabby department store. Rumors about Veronica's sticky fingers had circulated around Los Angeles for years, but the real thunder struck when she was caught in an ordinary shop trying to steal something trivial. These weren't diamonds or designer dresses. Lake was arrested for shoplifting underwear, socks, cheap makeup. The sight was heartbreaking. A former screen goddess, wrapped in a worn-out coat, attempting to slip past the register with items worth less than the tips she once casually left waiters. Security, failing at first to recognize the fallen star of the glass key, acted without mercy. Once her identity became known, the scandal exploded. Veronica didn't cry or beg. She stared at the police with the same glacial gaze she'd perfected on screen, as if they were to blame for her poverty. The press savored every second of her humiliation, turning a femme fatale into a pitiful shoplifter whose hands shook not from fear, but from years of alcoholism. Veronica Lake's kleptomania was soaked in bitterness and poison. Unlike Lamour, who stole to build a collection, Veronica stole out of despair and rage. She felt betrayed by the dream factory that had drained her dry and tossed her aside the moment her bangs went out of fashion. Every stolen item was a small victory over the system that destroyed her. She didn't steal because she needed those miserable socks. She stole because the act itself gave her the illusion of power. In a mind clouded by alcohol, theft became a form of protest. If Hollywood had stolen her future, she would steal its material present. Colleagues who once feared her sharp tongue now avoided her altogether, afraid she might help herself to something from their bags as well. Lake became an outcast among her own kind, a living reminder that the distance from fame to a jail cell is just one wrong step and one stolen lipstick. By the end of her life, Veronica Lake had almost vanished from view, working as a waitress in cheap diners under an assumed name. She lived in low-rent hotels, and managers often noticed that after she checked out, towels, ashtrays, even light bulbs were missing from the rooms. Kleptomania had become her second nature, her last connection to a world of possessions she once owned in abundance. She no longer stole on a grand scale, she simply cleared the space around her, as if building a barricade from petty clutter. Those who recognized the aging woman with sad eyes as the legendary Veronica Lake preferred to stay silent. It was too painful to watch a national American icon turn into a petty thief stuffing free sugar packets and cheap spoons into her pockets. She died in 1973. Nearly penniless, leaving behind only the shadow of former greatness and a long list of minor thefts that became the epitaph of her ruined life. Veronica Lake remains in history as a tragic figure, a victim of the industry and of her own demons. Her stealing is not just a criminal footnote, but a cry for help from a woman who lost everything, including herself. She deceived us with her beauty, made us believe in her invulnerability, but the truth was far more grounded and far dirtier. Her sticky fingers were merely a symptom of a deep wound inflicted by Hollywood. Today, looking at her flawless noir close-ups, we can't help searching for that spark of madness that would later guide her hand in a department store aisle. Veronica Lake proved that even the brightest star can burn out, leaving behind only the bitterness of stolen moments. She was a queen of the screen who ended her journey as the queen of secondhand shops, a reminder that in Hollywood, even the most beautiful gaze comes with a price, sometimes paid in freedom and dignity.
Zsa Zsa Gabor was a woman who built a career simply by being herself, dazzling, capricious, and fantastically expensive. 9 husbands, millions in diamonds, and an eternal darling delivered with a Hungarian accent created the image of a woman floating above earthly concerns. Yet behind this cloud of feathers and chiffon hid the iron grip of a predator who was not accustomed to paying for what she could simply take. Unlike Veronica Lake, who stole out of necessity, Zsa Zsa did it out of pure arrogance. She genuinely believed the world was her personal treasure chest, and every boutique on Rodeo Drive was merely a dressing room where things waited for their moment to adorn her body. Zsa Zsa did not recognize rules. To her, entering a shop and leaving with an unpaid accessory was not a crime, but a form of gratitude for the honor of her presence. She turned kleptomania into a social spectacle, convinced that her charm was a convertible currency, far more valuable than any scraps of paper in a wallet. Zsa Zsa was the heroine of countless rumors in luxury retail circles. Sales associates in high-end boutiques knew if Madame Gabor came in to try on earrings, she had to be watched like a hawk. But Zsa Zsa was a master of distraction. She could shower a consultant with compliments, stage a theatrical fitting of a dozen dresses, and meanwhile a brooch or a bottle of elite perfume would accidentally find its way into her handbag or the folds of her fur. The loudest scandal erupted when her audacity crossed all limits. She did not merely steal an item, but got into a physical altercation with a police officer who dared to stop her limousine. That was Zsa Zsa in a nutshell. She did not fear the law. She despised it. When caught committing petty theft, she never apologized. With a blinding smile, she would declare,
"Darling, this isn't stealing, it's a gift. The owner was so charmed by my visit that he simply forgot to mention it was complimentary." This habit of presenting a crime as an act of generosity on her part disarmed even the toughest detectives. Why would a woman with access to millions stoop to banal shoplifting? Hollywood psychologists whispered that for Zsa Zsa, every stolen object was a surrogate for love and adoration. She was addicted to tangible proof of her own importance. If she could walk out of a store without paying, it meant she was still that Zsa Zsa, the one before whom all doors opened and all eyes closed. It was a dangerous game with her own ego. Stealing gave her a rush of adrenaline that even the most lavish weddings could not provide. She collected things not for their value, but for the sheer fact of possessing them effortlessly. Her dressing rooms were always buried under piles of clutter she dragged in from film sets and travels. Everything from colleagues' silk scarves to silver photo frames taken from hotels. For her, there was no such thing as someone else's. There was only mine and what will soon be mine. Even when Zsa Zsa found herself in the defendant's chair, she turned it into a show. In 1989, after the infamous incident involving a slap to a police officer and the charges that followed, numerous sordid stories about her sticky fingers resurfaced. But instead of showing remorse, she hired the best lawyers and transformed the trial into a circus, posing for cameras and outfits worth more than the annual budget of the Los Angeles Police Department. She understood that in Hollywood there is no such thing as bad publicity if you know how to frame it. Her kleptomania became part of her legend, the image of an eccentric diva who lived by her own rules. Colleagues avoided inviting her into their homes, fearing for the safety of small antiques, but Zsa Zsa merely shrugged. She knew she would be invited anyway, because without her scandalous presence, any party would be dull. She robbed the system of its patience and common sense, all while remaining an unsinkable icon. Zsa Zsa Gabor lived nearly 100 years, leaving behind a trail of diamonds, scandals, and unpaid bills. She proved that if you steal with your head held high enough, the world will start treating it as a charming quirk rather than a criminal offense. Her life was the greatest con of all, with herself as the criminal, the victim, and the star witness. Zsa Zsa outwitted time and the law, leaving us to wonder whether she truly suffered from kleptomania or whether it was the longest and most successful PR campaign in history. She departed, leaving behind mountains of possessions, each hiding a story of either a generous gift or an artful theft. Zsa Zsa Gabor will forever be remembered as a woman who knew the price of everything but preferred to not pay for anything, reminding us that in a world of big money and blinding lights, even the most ordinary theft can be cut into a dazzling diamond.
Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead was a force of nature, a human hurricane whose raspy basso voice and habit of calling everyone darling, so she wouldn't have to bother remembering names, masked one of the most audacious kleptomaniacs high society ever produced. Unlike beaten-down shoplifters sneaking through aisles, Tallulah operated with the grace of a predator at a dinner party. For her, any social visit was an operation of elegant expropriation. She had no need for money. She was the daughter of the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives and commanded enormous fees. What thrilled her was the act itself, claiming what belonged to others, openly, shamelessly, in plain sight. While hosts poured champagne and applauded her wit, Tallulah's ring-covered fingers were already efficiently exploring mantelpieces and antique cabinets. She turned theft into a social performance. Stealing a producer's gold lighter or a colleague's silver spoon was as natural to her as smoking an entire pack of cigarettes in a single evening. Bankhead possessed a level of audacity that bordered on the supernatural. She could lounge on a sofa, holding forth on Nietzsche or the theater, while calmly slipping a decorative figurine into the deep plunge of her neckline or the folds of her fur coat. If she was caught in the act, and it happened often, she didn't blush or apologize. She would erupt into her famous laugh, the kind that made windows tremble, and declare, "Darling, this little thing was looking at me so sadly I simply had to take it home so it wouldn't rot in your dusty mausoleum."
Her charisma was so overwhelming that the robbed hosts often ended up feeling guilty for even noticing something was missing. She stole Cartier lighters as casually as other people lost matches. Her dressing rooms and hotel suites were always crammed with small objects bearing other people's monograms, a silent chronicle of her raids on the finest homes of New York and Los Angeles. Tallulah's kleptomania had nothing to do with hoarding. She often lost what she stole the very next day or gave it away to the first taxi driver she met. For Bankhead, theft was a weapon against unbearable boredom and an inner void she drowned in alcohol and drugs. Taking something that wasn't hers gave her an instant rush of adrenaline, a feeling that the rules of decency were made for mortals, not for her. She lived in a state of permanent rebellion. If she spotted a beautiful perfume bottle in a colleague's dressing room, it would inevitably migrate to her own table. When accused of stealing, she might reply, "I didn't steal it. I gave the thing a second chance at an interesting life." It was a philosophy of destruction. She robbed her friends of peace and property alike, turning every party into a minefield where no one knew whether they would leave with all their belongings intact. In the theater, Tallulah was feared more than bad reviews. Actresses who shared the stage with her knew that if a handbag was left in a common area, anything shiny or remotely valuable would vanish. Bankhead stole powder, lipstick, hairpins, even personal letters, which she later read aloud with glee in the dressing room. She was an energy vampire, feeding her dominance with material trophies. During the filming of Lifeboat, Alfred Hitchcock once complained that Tallulah had managed to make off with a piece of crucial prop equipment simply because she liked the texture of the metal. She was impossible to negotiate with. Her moral compass had shattered in her youth, and theft was just one facet of her self-destructive grandeur. She lived by a simple rule: if I see it, I take it. And Hollywood endured her excesses without protest as long as she continued to deliver her brilliant, unrepeatable performances. Tallulah Bankhead died in 1968, leaving behind a trail of empty bottles, cigarette butts, and hundreds of objects that had never belonged to her. After her death, relatives uncovered literal mountains of clutter: lighters, spoons, brooches, gloves, piled together in heaps, many items never even unwrapped in the scarves they'd been smuggled out in. She was the queen of kleptomaniacs, a woman who robbed life itself of the chance to be ordinary. Tallulah proved that one could be an aristocrat by blood and a thief by vocation without seeing any contradiction in it. We remember her as a rebel and a great actress, but in the shadow of her fame remained thousands of petty thefts, each one a small nail in the coffin of her reputation. Tallulah Bankhead didn't simply leave this world. She took a piece of everyone who ever made the mistake of turning their back on her, reminding us that a true diva never exits empty-handed.
Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor was more than an actress. She was the last of the great screen goddesses, a woman whose appetite for luxury could rival only her paychecks. Yet Liz had one particular habit that gave the lawyers at MGM and 20th Century Fox nervous tics. She almost never returned valuable props. If she wore a dress embroidered with real gold or a necklace set with precious stones in Cleopatra or Rhapsody, the chances of those items ever making it back to the studio warehouse were effectively zero. Taylor did not consider this theft in any conventional sense. She genuinely believed that once an object had touched her body, it automatically became part of her legend. For her, borrowing a sable cape from the costume department or a ring worth the budget of a small town was as natural as breathing. She lived with a sense of absolute chosenness, and Hollywood, paralyzed by her beauty and box office power, obediently paid for her forgetfulness for decades. During the filming of the legendary Cleopatra, Taylor's passion for appropriating other people's property reached its peak. The film's budget was bursting at the seams, while Elizabeth continued to collect her costumes. Each time the costume designers timidly mentioned the return of gold sandals or wigs made of real hair threaded with gold, Liz staged a grand scene or suddenly fell ill, locking herself in her trailer along with the items in question. In the end, she removed dozens of costumes from the set, their total value running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The studio feared a scandal involving its biggest star and simply wrote the losses off as production expenses. For Taylor, this was a form of additional compensation. She regarded producers as her subjects, obligated to pay tribute to their queen. This was not the kleptomania of the poor, it was the arrogant pillaging of a monarch who did not know the word no. Rumors circulated that Taylor's passion for borrowing extended to her personal circle as well. If Liz saw a piece of jewelry on a friend or colleague that she adored, she might ask to wear it for one evening at an important event. But the evenings stretched into years, then decades. Her collection grew with items their owners were simply too embarrassed to ask back, afraid of seeming petty next to the great Liz. Taylor had a rare gift for making it seem as though an object had always belonged to her. She wore forgotten brooches and bracelets with such casual confidence that former owners began to doubt their own memories. It felt as though they truly had gifted her the treasure themselves. She robbed people of their resolve, using her status as an impenetrable shield. In Elizabeth Taylor's world, ownership was determined not by receipts, but by whose neck the diamond happened to grace. Taylor did not limit herself to clothing and jewelry. If her dressing room on set was furnished with antique furniture or decorated with rare vases to set the mood, those items found their way into her personal truck on the final day of filming. She might say she had grown attached to that chair, or this rug perfectly matched her eyes, and that was the end of the discussion. Producers, eager to keep their star loyal, simply looked the other way. Liz turned theft into an upper-class privilege. While minor actresses were caught stealing lipstick, Taylor walked studios out by the truckload. It was a high-stakes game. She stole Hollywood's very history, turning her home into a warehouse of priceless evidence of her screen dominance. Her sticky fingers wore silk gloves, but their grip was deadly. After Elizabeth Taylor's death, her legendary collection of jewelry and costumes was sold for record-breaking sums. The irony was that many of those lots were the very items she had once forgotten to return to studios or friends. She outwitted the system twice, first by taking the objects for free, then by making the world pay millions for the right to own them as relics from Liz. Taylor proved that if you are great enough, your sins can be transformed into virtues. We remember her as an icon of beauty and philanthropy, but in the shadow of her violet eyes, there will always be that same girl who simply could not give back what had fallen into her hands. Elizabeth Taylor departed like a true queen, taking with her everything she could reach and leaving Hollywood with empty vaults and eternal admiration for the sheer grandeur of her audacity.
Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford was a woman forged from steel, ambition, and face powder. For her, there were no half measures. If she was a star, then everything around her had to match her status, even if that everything belonged to MGM. Joan was not an impulsive thief. Her actions resembled a military operation. She believed the sets she worked on absorbed her energy, and leaving them to gather dust in a warehouse was nothing short of sacrilege. If Crawford spotted an Art Deco armchair or an antique lamp on set that would fit perfectly into her home, the fate of that object was sealed. She didn't slip things into a handbag like a petty amateur. She coldly ordered her assistants to arrange delivery to her house while the producers looked the other way. Joan was convinced the world had to bend to her standards, and if that meant stripping a studio bare, she did it with the icy composure of a queen. Crawford devised a brilliant system to justify her raids on costume and furniture departments. Every time she was caught trying to remove expensive props, she switched into the great actress mode. With a stone face, Joan declared that this specific item, whether a hand-embroidered robe or a silver tray, was essential for her to continue inhabiting the role at home. She insisted she couldn't play an aristocrat if she didn't drink her morning coffee from the same pot used on screen.
It was psychological manipulation at its finest. Who would dare deny Crawford her artistic process? In the end, her estate turned into a massive prop warehouse where every corner had been borrowed from a different film. She didn't steal out of greed, but from a pathological need to own everything connected to her fame. To her, each object was a trophy, proof of her power over Hollywood's time and space. On set, Crawford was a tyrant, and her kleptomania extended to everyone unlucky enough to fall under her shadow. Younger actresses and assistants knew the rule. If Joan complimented your scarf or your perfume bottle, consider it gone. She could walk into someone else's dressing room, take what caught her eye, and leave without a word. If confronted, she stared through the person with her enormous, unsettling eyes and said the item had been lying badly or that she needed it for an important purpose. Her authority was so overwhelming that no one dared demand their property back. Joan robbed people not only of material things, but of their right to protest. She was a predator in furs, taking whatever she deemed worthy of her attention and leaving behind only fear and empty bottles of expensive perfume. Joan's passion for stealing sometimes reached the point of absurdity. She might pocket a set of napkins from a restaurant or an ashtray from a hotel if it matched her color scheme. Her home was a monument to her fanatical pursuit of perfection, built on a foundation of stolen trifles. Colleagues whispered that Crawford even borrowed interior ideas from her rivals, literally removing small decorative objects from their homes during visits so she could recreate the look in her own. She lived in a state of constant competition with the entire world. Theft was her way of proving she could have anything she wanted, rules be damned. She was a kleptomaniac of the highest rank, whose so-called perfectionism was nothing more than a polished excuse for appropriating other people's work and property. By the end of her life, Joan Crawford had become a recluse in her impeccably furnished apartment, surrounded by objects with criminal pasts. She died in 1977, leaving behind the reputation of a woman who was feared and resented. Many of the items she had borrowed from the studios remained in her possession until the very end. Crawford proved that in Hollywood you could be a thief and still maintain the image of a flawless lady, provided you had enough willpower and enough makeup to hold the mask in place. She fooled everyone into believing in her perfection, while her closets overflowed with stolen props. Joan Crawford departed this world carrying with her the secrets of countless vanished MGM treasures, leaving us with the realization that beneath the perfect order of her life there had always lurked the chaos of stolen desires.
Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn was the embodiment of adventure on screen, but off-camera his life was even more criminal and reckless. While audiences admired his noble Robin Hood, Flynn himself was emptying producers' pockets and prop warehouses with the skill of a seasoned pickpocket. For him, theft was neither illness nor necessity. It was a natural extension of his swashbuckling character. Flynn genuinely believed that rules were made for boring people, and a soldier of fortune like himself was entitled to any trophy he fancied. If, on the set of The Seahawk or Captain Blood, he took a liking to a sword, an antique pistol, or even an embroidered doublet, he simply took it. When prop masters timidly asked what had happened to the Damascus steel saber, Errol would flash his blinding grin and reply that he had drowned it in the ocean during battle or given it to a beautiful lady. In reality, these trophies went straight onto his legendary yacht, the Sirocco, which was packed to the rafters with stolen studio property. Flynn's ship was his personal kingdom, where neither U.S. law nor Warner Brothers rules applied. Being invited aboard the Sirocco was every partygoer's dream, though few realized they were sitting on chairs stolen and drinking from glasses borrowed from the finest hotels in the world.
Flynn had a pathological passion for collecting objects with a story. He stripped luxury hotel suites of everything from monogrammed ashtrays to expensive paintings. Fellow actors attending his parties would recognize with horror items in the decor that had mysteriously vanished from film sets. But Flynn was so charming that accusing him of theft felt impossible. He turned stealing into a joke. Once, he stole a massive bronze statue from a hotel lobby by throwing a coat over it and carrying it out in front of stunned staff, shouting jokes about a sick friend who desperately needed fresh air. His audacity was so outrageous, it became part of his legendary bad boy image. Friendship with Errol was dangerous, not only to one's reputation, but also to one's wallet. Flynn adored petty, mischievous theft. He might visit a colleague and leave with their favorite lighter or a rare book edition. It was a form of dominance. Flynn proved he could take anything he wanted from you, and you would still seek his approval. He had a habit of forgetting to return debts, belongings, and even clothes. If he borrowed a tuxedo for a premiere, the owner could say goodbye to it forever. Errol would either lose it during another binge or declare that the garment had fused with his body and separation would be painful. In his world, everything was communal, provided that everything eventually ended up with him. He robbed his friends of their trust, turning every interaction into a gamble he always won with someone else's property in his pocket. Warner Brothers hated Errol as much as he loved the money he brought the studio. Errol was an accountant's nightmare. He did not merely steal props, he destroyed them or claimed them in bulk. There were cases when, after filming wrapped, Flynn simply loaded entire sets onto his truck and drove them to his Mulholland Farm villa, announcing that they created the right mood for his future roles. The studio tried to deduct the losses from his salary, but Errol countered with such extravagant bills for emotional distress and dangerous stunts that Warner Brothers often ended up in the red. He was one of the first actors to openly mock the system, proving that a star of his magnitude stood above petty notions of private property. For him, theft was a form of anarchy, a manifesto of freedom against corporate control. Errol Flynn died at 50, leaving behind mountains of debt, broken hearts, and a collection of objects, not a single one of which had been honestly purchased. He lived like a comet, burning everything in his path and carrying off fragments of other people's lives with him. After his death, it became clear that much of his wealth was an illusion, made up of items he had once pinched from colleagues and studios. Flynn proved that one could be a thief, a womanizer, and a drunk, and still have the world call it eccentricity, provided one possessed a devilish smile. We remember him as a hero who robbed the rich, but the truth is, he robbed everyone he could reach. Errol Flynn departed as he had lived, leaving nothing truly his own behind, but carrying with him a legend he had stolen from reality itself.
Clara Bow. Clara Bow was Hollywood's first true sex symbol, the woman who embodied the roaring 20s with their jazz, short skirts, and forbidden pleasures. But behind the bow-shaped lips and fiery red curls lived a wounded girl from the slums of Brooklyn, raised amid hunger and the madness of a broken mother. That terror of poverty never left Clara, even when her paychecks reached obscene heights. For Bow, stealing was not a whim, but a survival instinct burned into her nervous system. She did not believe in the stability of success and sincerely felt that any day could be her last, so everything had to be secured now.
On Paramount sound stages, Clara was infamous for her ability to make objects vanish into thin air. She didn't steal because she lacked money. She stole because only a solid object in her pocket gave her a fragile sense of safety in a world built of spotlights and illusions. Bow's obsession with jewelry was almost pathological. She could spend hours trying on rings and bracelets rented by the studio for filming, only to conveniently forget to take them off. When assistants politely reminded her about returns, Clara would erupt into full-scale hysterics, crying, fainting, insisting the stones were her only friends. More often than not, she hid the jewelry in her famous wigs or deep in the folds of her clothes. Eventually, the jewelers who supplied the productions imposed a strict condition: an armed guard had to remain at Bow's side. Even that didn't always work. Clara was a master of distraction. She could start a fight or suddenly flirt with the guard while her nimble fingers slipped another brooch into hiding. For her, it was a way of ensuring herself against a future that felt like a black hole, ready to swallow her at any moment. Her colleagues learned to lock their doors whenever the red-haired menace was nearby. Clara had a habit of wandering into other people's dressing rooms and taking anything she found valuable or simply beautiful. It wasn't limited to makeup or perfume. She could walk off with a fur stole, an antique watch, even small pieces of furniture. When caught in the act, she defended herself with disarming honesty. "I just thought you didn't need it anymore." Her mental state was unstable, and many dismissed her thefts as eccentricity or blamed her difficult childhood. But for Clara, this was daily labor, the methodical building of reserves. Her own home was crammed with stolen goods, bolts of fabric, sets of dishes taken from studio kitchens, piles of clothing she never wore. She was like a magpie, dragging everything that shimmered back to her nest, trying to bury an inner emptiness and a constant fear of ending up back in the Brooklyn slums under mountains of clutter. By the early 30s, rumors about Clara's kleptomania and chaotic lifestyle became public knowledge. Lawsuits from former assistants accusing her of theft and unpaid wages finally shattered her reputation. Studio executives who once indulged her quirks grew tired of a star who brought nothing but trouble. Clara couldn't understand why the world had suddenly turned against her. In her mind, she was only taking what she deserved in return for her suffering. Her stealing became a metaphor for her life. She tried to steal the right to happiness from fate itself, only to be buried under the weight of material junk. She robbed herself, destroying her career for the brief comfort of a stolen necklace or dress. In the end, Hollywood presented her with a bill she couldn't pay, neither with money nor with her fading talent. Clara Bow spent the rest of her life in psychiatric hospitals and isolation, battling severe depression and paranoia. She died in 1965, nearly forgotten by the world she had once set on fire. After her death, heirs discovered entire storerooms of belongings, many still in their original packaging or bearing studio wardrobe tags from 30 years earlier. Clara Bow proved that fame does not heal old wounds. It only offers more tools for self-destruction. She remains in history as the first It Girl, but in the shadow of that title will always hide a small thief with frightened eyes, a woman who never managed to believe she no longer needed to steal in order to survive. She left us her great films and the bitter realization that even at the top of Olympus, one can remain a prisoner of a poor and terrified childhood.
Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich was the embodiment of extreme elegance, discipline, and cold European charm. Yet behind that flawless facade stood a calculating collector who believed that anything touched by her silk-gloved fingers automatically became her property. Unlike the hysterical Clara Bow or the chaotic Tallulah Bankhead, Marlene stole methodically, with the dignity of a Prussian officer.
She did not hide objects in undergarments. She simply took them and walked away, fixing witnesses with a look that suggested they ought to pay her for the privilege of observing the act of appropriation. For Dietrich, there was no boundary between props and a personal wardrobe. If, during the filming of Shanghai Express, she took a liking to an antique casket or a designer veil, she would simply carry it off to her hotel room. When producers timidly mentioned returning the item, Marlene would switch on her legendary icy detachment and declare that the object had lost its aura or required cleaning, after which it vanished forever. Dietrich's passion for theft extended far beyond film studios. She was a frequent guest at the finest jewelry houses of Paris and New York, and a trail of reports about missing trinkets followed in her wake. Marlene possessed a hypnotic influence over staff. She could spend hours discussing gemstone cuts, trying on dozens of rings, and at some point one of them would simply dissolve into her palm. She never rushed. Every movement was measured to the millimeter. At society gatherings, she behaved with even greater audacity. Hosts of luxurious mansions knew that if Dietrich visited their home, it was wise to count the silver spoons, lighters, and small antique figurines after she left. This was not kleptomania in its pure form. It was a profound conviction of her own exceptionality. Marlene believed she stood so far above ordinary mortals that their possessions ought to serve her as subjects serve their queen. The psychological foundation of Dietrich's behavior was more complex than mere greed. She was a woman myth who had constructed her own identity, and she constantly required material proof of her dominance over the world. Every stolen brooch or dress borrowed from a colleague became a trophy in an endless war for status. She did not rob people. She robbed reality itself, surrounding herself with objects that carried history within them. Her dressing room was always kept in perfect order, yet insiders knew that her trunks concealed mountains of items borrowed from rivals, costume designers, and even casual acquaintances. Dietrich stole ideas and gestures as well, turning other people's individuality into her own. She was the greatest marauder of human qualities and material values, using her talent as a universal master key to any safe. The most astonishing part of Dietrich's story was that no one ever tried to hold her accountable. She was too valuable an asset, too powerful a symbol, to stain her name with lawsuits over stolen coffee services. Studios simply built Dietrich losses into film budgets as unavoidable overhead. Dietrich knew this and exploited her immunity to the fullest. She could strip a wardrobe department after filming, carrying off dozens of pairs of handmade shoes, and return to the studio the next morning, looking as though she had done them a favor. She outwitted the system by turning theft into a privilege. Her colleagues despised her for it, yet showered her with compliments to her face, wary of her venomous tongue and immense influence. Marlene Dietrich was the only one who managed to turn criminal inclinations into an integral part of an aristocratic image. Marlene spent her final years in a Paris apartment, rarely leaving her bed and admitting no one. She lived among thousands of objects collected over decades, many of them with a shadowed past. Her apartment was filled with suitcases of furs, gloves, jewelry, and props from her greatest films. She died in 1992, leaving behind auction collections that stunned the world with their richness. The irony was that after her death, her own belongings became objects of pursuit for collectors, just as she herself had once hunted other people's treasures. Marlene Dietrich proved that in Hollywood one could be a thief, provided one knew how to wear a tailcoat and look down on the world. She departed, leaving us her myth and the understanding that a true diva never asks permission. She simply takes what she believes is hers by right of legend.
We have seen that behind the blinding credits and godlike profiles stood ordinary hoarders, petty thieves, and calculated looters for whom other people's property was nothing more than an annoying technicality. This investigation proved that the Dream Factory did not run on honesty, but on total indulgence and the law of the strong. The brighter the star shone, the longer its sticky fingers became. We pried open the chests of Dorothy Lamour and Clara Bow and found not keepsakes, but evidence of a pathological fear of poverty. We tore the silk gloves off Elizabeth Taylor and Marlene Dietrich, revealing that their aristocratic poise was merely a convenient screen for the industrial-scale appropriation of other people's fortunes. It turned out that legendary macho men like Errol Flynn were little more than charming shoplifters, while intellectual icons like Hedy Lamarr couldn't resist cheap costume jewelry at the drugstore counter. These are not just stories of kleptomania. They are a verdict on an entire era that placed these people on pedestals and allowed them to steal our hearts, our money, and our props without a shred of remorse. For decades, Hollywood fed us fairy tales about nobility, while its leading heroes were stuffing silver spoons and studio diamonds into their pockets. We witnessed the tragedy of Veronica Lake, whose fall began with the theft of socks, and the arrogance of Zsa Zsa Gabor, who considered stealing a tax levied on her beauty. Now, when you revisit the classics, you won't be able to unsee the greed flickering in their eyes. Every time a ring gleams on screen or the shadow of an antique chair cuts across the frame, you'll wonder where that object ended up after the director called cut, on which attic floor or in which secret safe it came to rest. The true legacy of these idols is not only celluloid, but endless lists of missing property, unpaid bills, and betrayed colleagues. The Golden Age turns out to have been merely gilded, and beneath that thin layer of gold lies the rust of ordinary human baseness. We close this chapter with the understanding that icons are not sinless and that their sticky hands were the most natural thing about them. The show is over, the dressing rooms are empty, and the thieves have long vanished into the shadows of history, leaving us with the bitter aftertaste of a truth that can no longer be ignored.